We're going to be looking at the progressive movement, which is an era of 1890 to 1919. And these are the presidents that will be involved in this particular era. Get used to them. They are their cartoon figures as well as their actual photographs. So here we are in section 1. And we're looking at, during the 1800s, Americans again became concerned with social problems in the United States. I think we're pretty big on that too. We call it the rise of progressivism. Back then, progressivism began as a social movement and grew into political movement. Progressivism gained a strong voice in the White House when Theodore Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, TR, whatever you want to call him, became president in 1901. TR believed that strong corporations were good for America, but he also believed that corporate behavior must be watched to ensure that corporate greed did not get out of hand. Trust busting and federal regulation of business. Progressivism somewhat ended with World War I, but it is still in place in the culture today, somewhat. We still use this word, even though definitions change over 100 years. Who were the progressives? They believed that industrialism and urbanization created many social problems. They did not have a strong belief in social Darwinism, which is the theory that individual groups and peoples are subject to the same Darwinian laws of natural selection as plants and animals, meaning the lower people are lower because of their inadequate DNA and richer people are higher because of their better DNA. This concept was not a part of a political party, Democrat or Republican. Many progressives worked as journalists, teachers, politicians, and clergy, which are religious figures. The beginnings of progressivism. Poverty was created by unregulated financial markets. Unregulated means there's no rules. Who did not have regulations that could improve working conditions for the working class. Those are the people that work inside the factories, and these are mostly factories. In this century, the U.S., we no longer see that type of bad working conditions that existed before the progressives. The workers needed an educated voice that would speak for them to help them improve their lives. And let's face it, back then, many of these people stopped their education at 2nd, 3rd, 4th grade and went into the factories and worked. And so they couldn't even read sometimes or write their names in order to educate themselves. There is a term during this time, the muckrakers. They were crusading journalists who investigated social conditions and political corruption. Remember from the last chapter, there were no computers, and journalists spread the news. What appeared in print was now more powerful than ever. Big business, politics, and social issues were the topics that they fought to improve. Remember yellow journalism, so we had to watch out that we weren't being fooled. Okay, the roots of the progressive movement, we can see making government efficient, democracy and progressivism, and the suffrage movement. So what they did with making government efficient is that they felt that a good working government equaled a good society. And if government had a way of not being tied to corruption, then there was a better way of running the government and getting stuff done. So they gave 3 efficient modes, or they gave 3 ways that the city government could be run. The first one's probably the worst. The traditional mayor chooses the heads of the city departments, often inexperienced friends. If you hired your friend to do your social media, but they didn't even have a Facebook account, then obviously that was just you rewarding your friend with something to put them in charge of and pay them for. Second, commission plan. The city divided into departments run by an actual expert. And third, voters elect a council. The council elects the mayor. So the mayor's not elected by the people, but by the council. And the council hires the manager and appoints the heads of the department. So those are some better ways possibly to run a city government so that corruption couldn't fall into the hands of few. In Wisconsin, they elected a governor named Robert Le Fayette. The party bosses, he felt, controlled how the convention delegates were chosen for the presidency, thereby choosing a candidate. He pushed for a direct election of those candidates rather than what was happening at the time. And then there were electoral changes due to the progressives. So what happened was there's initiative, referendum, and recall. And those are just ways to bring about laws by the people rather than just by the legislatures. And then direct election of senators. This is unique because you guys live in a time where you just assume that senators are elected directly. But senators that serve in Washington, D.C. and represent the state were originally appointed by the state legislature and not elected directly by the people. This caused corruption, and the 17th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution made it happen the way it is today. Now, the suffrage movement is a word that sounds like suffer, so it sounds like you want to remove women's suffrage, but in fact, I would be very angry if you took away my right to vote, and that's what suffrage is. Women's had tough at first trying to get their right to vote because they often fought for the abolition of slavery and felt that, their right to vote for the African Americans would also come, and as well as women's, but that didn't happen. A Republican Congress introduced the 14th and 15th Amendments, but the women's right to vote was not added to those amendments. It was just African Americans, freed slaves. The movement builds support. 30 years after the end of the Civil War, which is when those other amendments were written, in 1890, women who wanted the right to vote, suffragettes, grew in power. Alice Paul organized a march on Washington, D.C. as president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. She left this group and formed another one called the National Women's Party. President Wilson, believe it or not, as a Democrat, did not want the women's right to vote. But finally, in 1920, the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote. New Zealand offered the first country the right to vote, and Wisconsin was one of the first states that allowed the right for women to vote. Now, the roots of the progressive movement, I'm so sorry, we are still there. Social welfare progressivism, a campaign against child labor. Now, I know it's hard to believe that kids wanted to go to school, because you probably can't stand that thought, but they actually weren't allowed. They had to work and were forced to stay out of school. They actually wanted to go to school instead of work. Children were considered good at many tasks due to their cheap labor and small features. Tiny hands get into small places. The National Child Labor Committee of 1904 formed to abolish child labor, which is children under 16 working in factories. Writers such as John Spargo wrote about child labor atrocities. He wrote about boys aged 9 and 10 who picked slag out of coal for 60 cents per 10-hour workday. This is when mandatory education laws began to be passed, requiring children to go to school. You now live under these laws. If you look to the boy down at the bottom right, you can see that he is hunched over, and that's due to hours and hours during his growth period in which he was disfigured because of bending over and trying to pick out this slag. Health and safety codes. Factory conditions were dangerous. The steel industry produced some of the most violent accidents that this journal reported. At the steel mill in Butler, Pennsylvania, a heavy pot of hot metal spilled molten steel into wet sand, causing a huge explosion which destroyed part of a plant. Streams of hot metal poured down onto the workmen, engulfing and literally cooking some of them. A machinist got his arm caught in a rapidly moving belt that jerked it from its socket, and he fell 50 feet to the floor. That is 5 stories. And then there was the prohibition movement. Basically, temperance is the idea that you do not have alcohol. And prohibition stopped it was the laws banning manufacture, consumption, transportation of all alcohol. And so that lasted 10 years, and Americans like to drink, so obviously it does eventually go away. Okay, so progressive versus big business. Progressives also focused on regulating big business. Today, we might think of these people as the Occupy Wall Street people. Even at the turn of the last century, 1900, people were concerned with too much money being in the hands of too few people. And they started the ICC, which is the Intercommerce Company, to regulate railroads because they were the big business at the time. You might look at tech industry now, to ensure fair rates and limit discrimination. Now you see Eugene V. Debs there to the right. He was an American Union leader and one of the founding members of the IWW. And 5 times candidate for the Socialist Party running for the United States. Now, we think socialists, why would there be socialists except for Cuba anymore? But in fact, Bernie Sanders is a socialist. So he believes that if you wanted to own a company, you could not, that the government should own the company and you should merely work for it. So that's his belief system in socialism. He doesn't believe in total ownership like communism. It's a democratic socialism. So some progressives wanted to move further on to socialism and the idea that government owns all industry. This would mean that if you, again, I stated all that stuff and you guys can see it there. We're going on to the next section, which is where we get to see a little more about Teddy Roosevelt. He revives the presidency. I shall see to it that every man has a square deal, no less, no more. His programs in his second presidency became known as the Square Deal. Roosevelt takes on these giant trusts, and you see some of these owners in this cartoon down at the bottom left. He believed Wall Street financiers, which are these powerful men, and powerful trust titans to be acting foolishly. While they were eating on fancy china and mahogany tables and marble dining rooms, the masses were roughing it. There seemed to be no limit to greed. If docking wages would increase profits, it was done. If higher railroad rates put more gold in their coffers, it was done. How much was enough? Roosevelt wondered. This was the core of Theodore Roosevelt's leadership. He boiled everything down to a case of right versus wrong, good versus bad. If trusts controlled the entire industry but provided good services, it was at reasonable rates. It was a good trust. So he left it alone. Only the bad trusts that jacked up rates and exploited consumers would come under attack. So you could see Theodore Roosevelt was not the type to initiate changes timidly. No, timid was not a part of his personality. The first trust giant to fall victim of Roosevelt's was J.P. Morgan's, and you can see him there in that picture. And he was a railroad and controlled the Northern Securities Company. The company had monopolized railroad shipping from Chicago to the Northwest. In 1904, the Supreme Court ruled that the monopoly violated the Sherman Antitrust Act. And then there was the strike of 1902, and what was happening is that everybody heated their homes back then with coal, and coal was getting so expensive. It was the equivalent of $12.93 per gallon of gas today. And with winter coming, Roosevelt needed to step in. He sent telegrams to the laborers and to the operators to hold a meeting with him on October 3rd in Washington. The strike became violent. Another important ramification to the anthracite strike was the establishment of state police forces. During the time of the strike, government regulations were in the hands of deputy sheriffs. So what did these people, the union workers, want? The miners wanted a 10% increase in wages and a 9-hour workday, but their union was not recognized. Bureau of Corporations, even though Roosevelt had to step in and file a lawsuit against big business, the Northern Securities Commission, he created a Department of Commerce and Labor to control trust in big business. During the Progressive era, inventions led to big business, which led to corruption, which led to regulation. Congress follows. The Expedition Act and the Hepburn Act went through Congress to help the federal government to control big business. The Hepburn Act powered the ICC, which you learned about before. There were many different railroad companies all over the U.S., and the ICC helped to regulate their rates. Now, this is gross, but it's great to read about because it's good history. Fortunately, we don't live in this time because of consumer protection. Consumer protection is the idea that you are a purchaser of goods, would be protected by regulations established by the federal government. Industries were being exposed for their lack of health concerns, health standards. The book by Upton Sinclair, The Jungle, looked at slaughterhouses in Chicago. Now, the word slaughterhouses depicts grossness, but of course it was worse. They would recycle bad meat back into good meat and then sell it to you as sausage. Now, conservation is the idea that the environment is protected, and Roosevelt loved the environment and valued natural resources, so he set aside several national parks to protect the land and the animals for future generations to enjoy. Timber resources, he protected the timber, which is the wood that houses are built out of at the time, and modern president of the United States. His presidency endowed the progressive movement with credibility, lending prestige to the White House, to welfare legislation, government regulation, and the conservation movement, the desire to make society more fair and equitable with economic possibilities for all Americans. He loved national parks, and this is one of my favorite, but you can see in that picture to the right some of the national parks around the United States that he protected. Section 3. Now we're on to a new president. This is Taft. Taft becomes president. He was 6 feet, 335 pounds. He was gigantic. He was Teddy Roosevelt's choice as a replacement because they were friends at the time. You can see that in that cartoon to the right. He was slower to move on issues than Roosevelt. He was thoughtful and dynamic in public. And then there are a few things that happened during his presidency that irritated the heck out of Roosevelt, which made him run in the next election. So the Payne-Aldrich Tariff Act. A tariff is a tax imposed on exports. Tariffs can slow business if a price is too high. The act was to be the first change in tariff laws since 1897. Payne was Cyrano Payne of New York. He reduced tariffs passed in the House, but when it went to the Senate, it had pieces substituted by Aldrich, who was Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island, calling for fewer reductions and increases in other tariffs. Both operations really just irritated both sides, Republicans and progressives, on the concept of tariffs. Now, again, tariffs can be good and bad, and it could either reward or punish the United States. Ballinger Pinchot controversy. Gifford Pinchot felt that Richard Ballinger was releasing public lands in forest to be developed for profit. But these are public lands, so he shouldn't be able to do that, right? It was accusations of improper handling of coal, and that should be coal field claims in Alaska. Not a state yet, but still there. So this is one of the controversies that split the Republican Party, and you'll see the ramifications of that in the 1912 presidential election. Taft's progressive reforms, he was in office for only one term, which is 4 years. He established a Children's Bureau to protect children from labor. He went after U.S. Steel and antitrust laws, and Teddy Roosevelt became angry and decided to run for president again in 1912. Generally more conservative than Roosevelt, Taft lacked his expansive view of presidential power and was generally a more successful administrator than politician. Taft achieved his lifelong goal when President Warren Harding appointed the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So you can imagine, he is our only person that has been president and Supreme Court justice. So during this particular election that we are discussing, what you see here in 1912, believe it or not, it is said to be even more crazy of an election than what we just had. We have Thomas Woodrow Wilson, better known as Woodrow Wilson, was an American politician, an academic who served as the 28th President of the United States. Almost kind of won by default in a way, twice by default, first by getting into the Democratic Party and then by winning the overall election. Born in Virginia, he spent his early years in Augusta, Georgia, Columbia, South Carolina. He's a Southerner, Southern Democrat. Wilson earned a PhD in political science at Johns Hopkins University. So basically, he liked that Southern Democrat principles, usually prejudice and kind of old-fashioned in a way. Teddy Roosevelt came back to run against Taft. He felt that Taft was destroying what he had built. During Taft's administration, a rift grew between Roosevelt and Taft, and they became the leaders of the Republican Party's two wings, the progressives, led by Roosevelt, and the conservatives, led by Taft. The progressive Republicans favored restrictions on the employment of women and children, promoted ecological conservation, and were more sympathetic towards labor unions. The progressives were also in favor of the popular election of federal and state judges and opposed to having judges appointed by the president and state governors, which happens both ways these days. 7 candidates for the Democratic ticket were at the convention. Champ Clark, yes, that's his real name, looked to be the winner, but failed to earn the 2/3 vote. So, like I said, Wilson's kind of at the Democratic convention and ends up winning it. Then New Freedom versus Nationalism. And this is a question. So, nationalism was Teddy Roosevelt's way of progressing the nation in ideas of workers' rights, workers' compensation, and federal trade to regulate industry. New Freedom didn't support monopolies in business and felt Roosevelt wanted too much government power. Reforming the tariffs. Wilson wanted these taxes reduced to increase competition, but these are tariffs on incoming goods. This means that other countries had better money opportunities than the U.S. Did right here. The Underwood tariff reduced incoming goods by 30%, so obviously American markets can't compete with that. With this weird tariff, the Underwood tariff, the 16th Amendment was written. This is the federal income tax, taking dollars out of your paycheck for the federal government, creating the IRS, who collects your tax money. So now the Wilson years. This is our last big slide. He reformed the banks, and this was kind of the biggest thing he did, which you see in the Federal Reserve System map there to the left. Aside from adding the 16th Amendment, which we are still daily paying for if you have a job, and taxing our income, Wilson decided to reform the national banks. He supported a Federal Reserve System. Banks would have to keep a portion of their deposits in a regional reserve bank. This would keep a cushion of money against the unforeseen losses. The Federal Reserve Act is a significant piece of legislation in our history. Federal aid and social welfare, 1916. Wilson signed a federal law regulating child labor. The Keating-Owen Child Labor Act prohibits employment of children under 14, though it failed to be supported by the Supreme Court when it was challenged. The Adamson Act established an 8-hour workday for the railroad workers. Unfortunately, just the railroad workers at the time. The Progressive Era is a new kind of government where the federal government protected the rights of workers. However, the rights of African Americans were never addressed. The Niagara movement tried to address this when 28 African American leaders met to establish the NAACP and to end lynchings and discrimination. Anti-Semitism, prejudice against Jews, was also not addressed by the progressives, but by the Anti-Defamation League. Both of these organizations are still around today, and so you could join them if you'd like to. And this is our summary and conclusion for this particular chapter.